Welcome to another Fresh Perspectives episode. I'm really excited to do this one with somebody who is a near and dear friend for many years, Marc Eichenbaum. He is finishing his Psy D, and it's difficult for me to even refer to you by your full name because I just know you as Ike. But he's completing his Psy D, already finished smicha with REITs, and has worked in a number of very important and unique places as a clinical psychologist. And really excited to have the conversation with you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's great to reattach with you, Yaakov, after many
Yeah,
years. So I'm looking
yeah,
forward.
very special. So we'll jump right into it. As with all of these, the opening question and prompt for you is something that you see from your psychological lens of entering the field now and already now at this point for a few years of the research and school and clinical work. Something you see as being significant and important. I do, before you begin your answer, I do want to just name, because you mentioned to me in our preparation of what you were going to speak about, for anybody listening, that this conversation may discuss and openly speak about some topics within mental health that are a little bit more sensitive, a little bit more intense in nature, and so I just want to name that. Everyone can do with that as they see fit. So, what is something that you see as a relevant and important issue that we as a community or society at large are facing?
Yeah. Um, so I think something that I could speak about based on my experience, although it's been mostly with the non-Jewish community, I think it applies equally as to the Jewish community, is suicide. Um, Suicide rates are skyrocketing. And my training and my experiences have mostly been with children and teenagers. And those rates have been, really rising as well. And I believe it's actually, suicide is actually the second um, most common cause of death for children. So there's something in our society that is causing these numbers to skyrocket. And, it goes without saying that we have to do something about it.
That is really interesting. That's the second cause of death for children.
I believe so. I
Wow.
believe, I believe that's what the research says. And my research is also involving suicide. My dissertation really looks at how children think of death. We know that how people understand death is actually a goes by developmental stages. So children understand death in different ways depending on how old they are and depending on what life experiences they've gone through. So what I'm looking at really is, how do suicidal children understand death? Is that very different from non-suicidal children's understanding of death? Is there something about how they view death that could teach us or could give us clues into what's really going on in their mind? And I'm also looking at, how does religion play a role in this as well? Because, as you can imagine, religion, and of course Judaism, but really many religions speak about what happens after a person dies, and what the purpose of life is all about. And it's plausible to think that that has an impact on what a child, and also a suicidal child, expects is going to happen after they die.
So that is really fascinating. I'm curious if you could give us a kind of quick version of what you found in terms of the way that children who are suicidal relate to what death is, if there is, a way that that contrasts with children who are not suicidal.
Yeah, there are a number of differences actually. One of the main differences is they think about death a lot more. So suicidal children are preoccupied with death. They also view death
Sorry,
as a
can
more
I
of a
pause you on
play.
that? Are they preoccupied with
Sure.
death or with suicide?
So I'm talking right now, even non-suicidal. I'm talking about, yeah, they're preoccupied with death, not necessarily
Aha. Okay.
suicide.
Okay. Very interesting. Yeah.
And that actually relates to the second point here is, they also often view death as more pleasant than children that are not suicidal. So a child who is suicidal, their understanding of death is like this pleasant, happy place, whereas someone who's not suicidal might not think of death in that way.
Hmm. So does that mean that I always would have assumed that the reason of what drives a child, God forbid, towards that would be a misery in this world, in this life. But what you're saying is maybe that's true, but actually part of it is also not just a misery with this world, but a perspective that the afterlife is pleasant and positive.
Yeah, it's not true for everyone, obviously, but I think there is a lot of truth to what you're saying. It's not just getting out of this world to escape what's here, but um, especially kids that are suicidal think of what's going to happen to them as, a better version of what's happening here,
Hmm.
which is very interesting. And that's why I'm really interested in adding the religion piece to this, because, that idea, is across whether a person is religious or not religious. And it'll be interesting to see if, religion makes them view death as, a more pleasant state than even that, or maybe some religions don't view death in that same type of way and make it less pleasant. So that's a very important piece that we're doing a study right now that is
Hmm.
ongoing.
So it's interesting because I assume the response to that is not to tell children that the afterlife is not pleasant, right? Like that's not the correction that they need, right? So what is the correction that they need in that regard?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And the clinical world of psychology, for the most part, doesn't really get into what happens in the afterlife, right? And it's actually very interesting if you look at the literature of how it describes this understanding of death as this pleasant state. It actually labels it as an immature version of death. So in the literature, it describes a mature version of death as, nothing happens, that's it. And this view of death as, a pleasant state is immature. And for a religious person, obviously those two words don't really sit well with us. So in the field of psychology, I don't know if there's any clear recommendations on what to do in these situations, but I certainly haven't seen anyone say that the way is to tell it is really to talk to a child about what happens after they die. It's really more focused on getting the child or a person, any person to feel better in the moment. And we could talk about that a little bit about suicide in general. What do we do when someone is feeling, so depressed or has so much anxiety that it's causing them to want to, take their own life?
Yeah. Wow. So what do you if again, obviously this is a much longer conversation, but in I guess just a couple of things that come to mind, what are you finding or what do you think might be contributing to why the rates of suicide and specifically in children are increasing?
Um, yeah, that is the question. And I think there's a number of different components here. And I think a lot of it has to do with a profound sense of loneliness that our society is uniquely capable of, causing people to feel. The research shows that loneliness and feelings of not having any meaning in life are, two of the main causes of suicidal thoughts, suicidal behavior. When it comes to kids, a lot of people blame social media as part of the reason for the mental health crisis in general, but also for the increase in suicidal thoughts and behavior. But it's not that social media in and of itself is causing these things to happen, but it's more like what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says. He calls it unsocial media, that it's causing us not to have these connections, these real life connections with with friends, with parents, because we're not just communicating with people on social media, but it's also causing us to spend less time with people in real life. So social media is one area that causes loneliness, but Western culture, and especially depending on where you live in the United States, can be very cold. People go their whole lives not knowing who their neighbors are. And we are social creatures, and we need to communicate and not just know who our neighbors are, but we are designed to bond with them and to spend our lives together. And I think actually this relates to something from this past week's parsha, if we could go there.
Sure. Yeah.
So, suicide, it's a very scary topic, but Moshe Rabbeinu says to Hashem, Hargeni na. He says Hargeni na in Parshas Ba'aloscha. And he's basically telling Hashem to kill him. And it's very astounding if you think about it. Moshe Rabbeinu has the closest connection to Hashem.
Never thought about it in that way. Yeah.
And it's not just Moshe Rabbeinu. Yirmiyahu says a similar line. Eliyahu, Yonah, Hanavi. We have these great figures who are expressing desires to die. And if we go back to the example of Moshe Rabbeinu for a moment, what does Hashem say to do afterwards? Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu to gather 70 Zakanim, 70 elders, so they could judge with him. And perhaps this is going back to what we're saying about this idea of loneliness. Moshe Rabbeinu, he was so great, but perhaps his greatness caused him to be unrelatable to everyone else. And he was, ostracized a little bit from society, and he couldn't have anyone to attach to connect to. And that's maybe also why he wanted Yisro, his father-in-law, to stay around for so long, because he was a priest. Maybe they had some type of connection in that way. But Hashem says to Moshe, I see you're lonely. I see that you're not able to, lo uchal levadi laseis es kol ha'am, that you're not able to gather this entire nation, to hold this entire nation. And therefore he gives him people that are like him now, judges, elders of society, who Moshe could finally relate to as, friends or at least acquaintances. And after that, Moshe feels better. Because it's this feeling of loneliness that affects everyone, from Moshe Rabbeinu to everyone in our community, everyone in the world. And we have to work on establishing our bonds with our family and with our neighbors and with our community in order to really facilitate, increased mental health.
Incredible. So well said. So it's very hard when speaking to someone who has as much insight and as much to say as you do, and as much that I and everyone would want to hear from you, and to keep it to these mini conversations. But transitioning to the second half of our conversation, although it won't be equal in time, to just see if we could take a few minutes to hear from you about what you see as something that, again, either our community or society at large are doing well from a psychological standpoint.
I think our community is great, or can be great, and is often great in this concept of togetherness and facilitating friendships. I'll give you an example. My wife and I were zocha to have a baby earlier this year, and my friends were very nice. They made a meal train for us, and one of my non-Jewish friends asked if I'm having a meal train, and he asked to sign up. And when he saw the list of all the names on the meal on the people who signed up for the meal train, he was astounded that I even knew this many people. He couldn't believe that there are that many people who would sign up to deliver a meal for someone else. So our community is great in that we live close together, we go to shul together. We see each other maybe learning we're learning together. We have so many opportunities to connect that this idea of loneliness, it still exists, but we can really lean into those things to help us in moments of loneliness.
Wow.
And I also think, though, that could, although it's a strength, and maybe this is already jumping into your next question, it could also potentially be a weakness at the same time. Because if you think about it, like, I don't know how familiar everyone is with Twitter, but Twitter just has this new update where you could actually read, or you could see how many people read your tweets. And it's one thing if you tweet and no one likes it or no one responds to it, but you maybe only a couple people saw it. But if you know that hundreds of people saw your tweet and also no one liked it or no one engaged with the tweet, that's even more upsetting. So in our community, we have, so many opportunities of connection. It could be doubly as devastating to the person who is not included in those things, to the person who sees that there is a group in shul, there's a group learning together, there's a group hanging out, and then is still not included. I can imagine that a person feels a sense of loneliness and despair because like they're surrounded with these opportunities that they're seemingly not a part of.
That is really, really important. Very, very insightful. I had never thought about it in that way, but it's in a sense, it's the strength of how much togetherness and how much connection our community has creates an even higher level of responsibility to make sure that everyone's included, because the pain and the fallout of those who are not is even greater because of how connected we all are. Wow, incredibly incisive. That's really, really, really important to think about. I'm going to take that with me. Thank you so much. Really, as always, a pleasure to spend time together, and really your insights and articulation are amazing, and I think really enlightening for so many.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.